Namaste. Hello, everyone. Previously, until now, I've only used this Facebook page to do my book readings, but I've decided to try something else. So we're going to have a dialogue today. And for those who are tuning in for the first time, I'm Dena Merriam, an author, best known for my book, The Untold Story of Sita. And I have a new book coming out in the fall, Sitas Yoga, the Yoga of Awakening. And I'm in dialogue with Michael Sternfeld, who is a scholar and producer, and over many decades has produced various productions of the Ramayana. Most recently, an audiobook called Sita's Gems, with Sita's words from Valmiki's Ramayana. So we're here to begin, and let's start by talking about one thing that we have in common, Michael, is our realization of Ram and Sita both as living presences actively working in the world now, not just historical realities. So let's get right into that.
I love, Dina, that you just dive right into the essence, and that is the essence. In some of our dialogues building up to this, we realize that the Ramayana is happening at every point in creation. It was itihasa, historical reality, but at the same time, these are living qualities in the world and also within us. And that's something that you've influenced me quite a bit because you have such deep insights into the nature of Sita, how she lives in our hearts. And it's a beautiful reality that you described in that book, Untold Story of Sita, which touched me so much.
I get writing the book. I mean, I have been devotee of Ram since I was in my early 20s. But when as I described at the beginning of the book, when I took a journey to Ayodhya, maybe 10 years ago, that's when a whole new dimension of that story opened for me. And when I speak about Sita or Ram, I always make the point that we can't just look at them as historical personalities, but as living presences, active in our life personally and collectively on the world scene. And I think that that's often hard to see because we see so much negative in our world today.
Mm.
You wonder, recently it sort of hit me. I thought, during World War II, there were many great souls on earth at that time. My own guru, Yogananda, was on earth.
Mm.
Ashura Bindo, Ramana Maharshi, Ananda Moyma, many great souls. And yet they couldn't stop Hitler. Or did they? Or did they?
Mm.
And there's a time lapse between the inner work and how it manifests outwardly. So maybe it took 10 years, but that there's a lesson in that. And I saw the same thing looking at Ram and Sita, how the sages were doing their pujas and meditations for years before Ram and Sita appeared on the scene.
Mm.
And maybe their work enabled that final victory, enabled Ram and Sita to appear so that the greatest negative threat at that time could be overcome. I think applying it to our life is very important now. We can't just look at it as historical. I mean, it's a very important teaching for every time, as you say, for
Mm.
all times and places.
I mean, and it's true. I mean, it's historical reality, but there's also the Shastra quality in the text. We learn from the text. We explore the text. We discuss the text from the Valmiki Ramayana, Tulsidas Ramayana, and of course, the many, many retellings, including the Untold Story of Sita. And yet, I think the deepest level, because you and I both share this, being longtime meditators, we've both been meditating for years, and that's an intrinsic quality of cultivation of our own inner being. And as you cultivate your own inner being, naturally these impulses arise inside of you, these devata qualities. We learn what the texture, the feeling, the essences of Sita inside of us. We learn the texture, energy, essence, the dharma of Ram inside of us. And we even cognize our Ravanic tendencies that live inside of us. So on one level, in the Ramayana, there was an outer battle. Certainly there was an outer battle. In this historical reality indicates that that was true. But isn't the inner battle also significant? There's always the forces of light and darkness happening on the outside, but there's also the shadow qualities, the balance of light and dark inside of us. I mean, we know the asuras and the devas have been battling it out also at every point in creation. I think part of this purification is for us to purify our own Ravanic tendencies. And how do you do that? That's a question.
It's common for people to look at the Mahabharata as an inner battle. And I think it's
Mhm.
because it was much later in time.
Mhm.
And we have the Gita, which sort of lays that out, that inner battle.
Mhm.
But I think it's important now to see the battle with Ravana in the same way as an inner battle, because whatever our tendencies are, they contribute to the collective. So if we see negative in the collective field, we have to know that all the many people on earth are contributing to that. It's our collective energies, right? So and I think that this is an eternal story. It's not like you ever reach a point where it's done, it's over.
Beautiful point.
It's what keeps creation going, the polarity, the tension, the pull between the light and the darkness. So in most cases, the light wins out eventually.
You know, Satya Eva Jayate, truth alone triumphs in the end. But sometimes it takes a little bit longer than we would like.
That's because we look in Earth time instead of cosmic time.
Very good point. And that's one thing that you've always helped me see because I think you step back and look at it in cosmic time. I mean, I look at it a lot, both on a psychological level, an archetypal level. What you just said, there's these forces of light and darkness. There's this polarity. I mean, in the Gita, it says it's beyond the play of opposites. And the Ramayana is filled, I think it's literally embedded in the code of the Ramayana, this display of opposite values. One value comes up, its opposite value comes up over and over again. I mean, Dasharatha just loves his son more than his own life, but yet he's made this commitment to that he has to honor his word, and Kaikeyi asks for these two boons. It's an impossible play of opposites. And yet both Dasharatha, who doesn't quite make it, he succumbs, but us, we have to reconcile these seemingly is the key word, opposite values. And we transcend to a deeper level of a synthesis that somehow embraces this. And this to me is the secret. It's like the code embedded in the Ramayana that constantly takes us and purifies our emotional body. I mean, and even though you took a slightly different, not slightly different, significantly different slant on what actually happened in the Ramayana, but my expertise is in the Valmiki Ramayana, and I see that code happening and the purification that happens, and ultimately we arrive at the same point. And I'm going to add one more point on that. I mean, I should mention to the viewers, this project Sita's Gems, I invited 12 women wisdom leaders to come, and we took the original Valmiki text, and then there was commentary. I invited Dena to be one of the commentators on this. And I don't hope you don't mind me saying, at one point you said, Michael, I'm a little uncomfortable doing this because this Valmiki Ramayana doesn't sync up with my perception of the story. And we had a dialogue about this. We got on the call and I wouldn't let you go. I really wanted you to participate. And in the end, I remember you said why you finally acquiesced and said, yes, I will do this is because you realize ultimately, in the end, no matter what the exact storyline, because there's been so many retellings of the Ramayana, in the end, the deeper level of truth and purification comes through. And you agreed to participate, and you gave several beautiful commentaries on this, which were very enlightening because you have a very different perspective, and that's what we wanted. So that's just an example of how the story, it's evolved in different times, in different ways, by different authors, told regionally, but yet the truth of the Ramayana somehow comes through.
Yes, I think that I did struggle with that. And in the end, I thought, well, I picked passages where I felt I could draw out the Sita that I knew, the Sita that I was in relationship with. And ironically, as I'm working on this new book, Sitas Yoga, each chapter is a different aspect of yoga. And one of them is the yoga of transcending anger. And each chapter that I write about, something emerges in my life that show me where I am with regard to that.
Mm,
So in a transcending anger, at that time I was writing it, I was experiencing anger at the political situation in the US right now. And so I had to, it was like Sita sitting in front of me,
mm,
teaching me how to deal with that reaction, which is why I say she's a living presence in my life. And it was working through every single chapter that there were things in my life that I had to look at.
mm,
And it gets subtler and subtler. But we think that we have transcended a certain emotion, fear or anger or greed or whatever, but it gets subtler and subtler. So there's a chapter on the yoga of transcending greed, of countering greed. And so what is greed? I mean, the most obvious thing is material possessions, the billionaires who want more and more and more. But there are other aspects of greed. The greed for in a relationship for more and more. Anything that makes you want more and
mm,
takes you out of that state of complete contentment and isness and
mm,
non-grasping.
mm,
And so she was taking me into subtler and subtler levels of 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 um, of emotions and qualities that I thought I had transcended. Because you can transcend the major ones. You can say, okay,
mm,
I'm not greedy
mm,
for material things, but what are the subtler aspects? And of course, Ravana was the epitome of greed and arrogance. And you could say, and then there's a whole chapter on the yoga of non-judgment. You can say, okay, well, I'm not a
mm,
judging person. Oh, but I was judging things about the political situation. I was.
mm, mm,
So that leads you into a difficult situation. Am I to get above all judgment? Well, the yogis are above all judgment. I mean, you can see that in my
mm,
version of Ram and Sita's interaction with Ravana was one of love. They recognized him as their disciple from eons ago who had fallen into this pit
mm,
of arrogance and greed and that compassion on him.
mm,
And they tried in every which way, but in the end, it was almost by his choice that he leave through Ram's grace, and sort of make amends in another plane for all that he had done. So there's so many different levels to everything that takes place, and you have to really develop discernment. It's very, very tricky. This whole issue of
mm.
non-judgment.
I mean, you brought up like about five incredible points that I want to comment on. I mean, just there, really deep stuff there, because you know, first of all, this level of discrimination and discernment, that's to me one of the most powerful values of the Ramayana. Even the Valmiki Ramayana, any version of the Ramayana, is this one thing that I think is consistent is the Ramayana takes you on discriminating finer and finer levels of dharma. You have to discern on a subtler level because there's lots of gray areas in the Ramayana, and it sharpens your emotional body, but it sharpens your discernment by being able to discriminate these gray areas. Was Ram right in killing Vali? You know, what was it like with Ram and Sita and the relationships? And I remember now one of the things that I wanted to bring up. One of the commentaries that you did for Sita's Gems was Sita's advice against cruelty, which is really appropriate right now. Where Ram, if you remember in that scene, the sages asked Ram to protect them, and Ram agreed to protect them, and that means he had to pick up his weapons. But the terms of his exile was that he would not be engaged because he was supposed to be a sannyas living in the forest. And Sita advised him against picking up these weapons because they might corrupt him because weapons have a way of doing that. And the dialogue between Ram and Sita was fantastic in terms of subtle discrimination on Sita presenting her case, Ram presenting his case. And through the process, we learn what is the right way and the right way to make a decision. Of course, your commentary, I remember, was that it's not that they really needed these lessons, although they are human and they are divine simultaneously. But it was a great teaching for us as the listeners. So what we see is, what's happening now, for example, political situation. It's great advice to discriminate on when we need to pick up our weapons And that's metaphoric as well as actual.
Yeah,
And when
yeah,
we need
yeah.
to just not do that and return to that inner wholeness, which goes beyond that. And I want to make one more commentary there too, is you talked about transcending emotions. And I think we're probably a little bit on the same page, but I'm slightly different, being a somatic therapist also. One of the things that in the Ramayana that's brilliant, all the characters, they feel their emotions fully and then they transcend them. I think that's a key point for me, is that you feel this complete expression of emotion. They just let it come out. They cry, they grieve, they shake, and then they transcend them and move on to maybe you could say a more whole, a sense of wholeness in dealing with them. And I think that two-step process is very important for anyone on the spiritual path. This is just a side note, but I think it's really important. Feel our emotions fully, then let them go. So then we don't suppress or deny that which is inside of us. So in the case of Ravana, which is what we wanted to talk about today, which was how do we deal with evil or what seems to be evil? And you brought up the main point just now. Ravana had an incarnation. Previously, he had the story of Jaya and Vijaya, where he did these actions out of the court of Dharma. And he had a choice whether he was going to live many lifetimes to purify that, or one lifetime where he would die at Vishnu's hands, incarnated as Ram. And he chose the latter. And there was divine symmetry and orchestration of this whole thing. And like you said, from the cosmic level, it was all unfolding according to the plan. But at an immediate level, it's really challenging to deal with, like you said.
I want to go back to something you said about the emotions, because the way I would describe it is that the goal is to reach a state where you're experiencing the world as you do, having the emotions that you do, but you're aware of another part of yourself
Mm,
that is the eternal part,
mm,
because this incarnation will disappear. I mean, you'll move on from this incarnation. All the circumstances and
mm,
everything,
mm,
whatever sorrows that you have, you move on from that. I mean,
mm,
when you take on your next
mm,
incarnation, the memory stays, but ultimately what the journey is to be anchored in that part of yourself. And Krishna says this in the Gita, to be anchored in that part of yourself which is immune from anything happening in the external world, because that's the ultimate reality. So in a way, and I go into this a lot in the Sitas Yoga, you're in both. You're in and out
mm,
of the world at the same time. And see, this is a lot of Sita's teachings of how to be present and engaged and do what needs to be done. At the same time, to be aware of yourself
mm,
in your ultimate nature, your ultimate
mm.
uh, pure being.
And you brought up the Gita. What's the ultimate teaching in the Bhagavad Gita? Yogastha kuru karmani. Established in being, perform action. Two parts. Established in being, perform action, the karmas. And yes, you're absolutely right. We're in agreement as when we go deeper. As we grow and evolve through deep meditation or other spiritual practices, we're cultivating that witnessing quality of our being, which we're anchored in that witnessing quality of our being while simultaneously engaged in the field of action, where these emotions, they don't have the grip quite so strong. They're there, we feel them, but they don't grip us and overshadow us as much. And that's, I think, really applies to Ravana and these Ravanic tendencies. We can feel the unbridled, what was Ravana? You brought this up earlier. That was another one of the points, this unbridled arrogance. Um, this, when we talked the other day, what's the line? Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
of the boons Ravana had from his devotion to Shiva, he had all these invincible boons that nothing could take him out, except, of course, men and monkeys, which he didn't even bother to mention because they were too puny to even consider. And in that arrogance, and he had this lust, greed, arrogance, and one thing that I find interesting, when you look at his culture, the Rakshasas culture in Lanka. It's a little sobering because there's a lot of parallels between what we see today. They had had the greatest wealth on the planet. They
Yeah.
had the most advanced weaponry on the planet because of they were very powerful. They were a Vedic culture. I mean, Ravana was one of the forerunners of the whole field of Gandharva, made incredible discoveries in Ayurveda. But there's some twist that happened with this greed, arrogance, and unlimited power and lust, which perverted this. The Rakshasas could have been a force for good. Even Hanuman, when he first saw Ravana, marveled at his presence, and he just said, "This could have been one of the greatest men on earth." But somehow it twisted, and we see
It-
that now.
it-
These tendencies in culture. Go ahead.
if there's a seed, you know, and you do a lot of sadhana, that seed can grow.
Mm,
So if you don't uproot that seed, I mean, there's a choice. You work on uprooting the seeds
mm,
of greed and anger and whatever, or they get cultivated.
mm,
And there are many people, we've seen it in the world today, who've done a lot of sadhana and become teachers and have big followings, cult leaders, and uh, go off on the left path,
mm.
lead people astray because their self-aggrandizement has taken over. We see this in both the spiritual world, and we see it in the political field and in the economic field.
Absolutely. And what is it? What is it? And here we're getting down to the nitty-gritty of it. Like you said, these seeds, like many of these spiritual teachers, I don't think they planned in advance to, um, I'm going to use my power to bring in lots of followers and then, you know, corrupt. I think they started with very pure intentions.
I agree.
But then they get involved and they see they have so many people adoring them and so many people coming to them, and that somehow fills them with a certain sense of false power. And that there's just a little switch that gets turned slightly. It's a very subtle switch. And 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 I think there are some truly evil people in the world. There's no question. But I think many people start with good intentions and somehow they get corrupted. And that process where they somehow get corrupted, I think you nailed it, Dina, where you talked, unless you uproot those seeds, and what's the line in the Gita? Um, roast the seeds of karma. Literally, you have to roast the seeds of karma. I remember that line. And that to me, what I feel, deep and long meditation does roast these seeds of karma. And I think there's other devotional practices that do that as well. My path has been more on the path of meditation, as yours seems to be as well. But there's many ways to roast these seeds of karma, and it's a matter of real self-inquiry to me to purify these shadows in yourself. That's where I find it's not just meditation, it's this deep knowingness of the self and literally not denying those impulses in you, just like you're doing in the yoga of Sita, which I can't wait to see that because this is like the practical handbook from Untold Story of Sita.
You know, I saw a study recently that showed that extreme power and wealth changes the personality,
Mm,
and I think they're on the verge of discovering changes the brain
mm,
chemistry. So
mm,
there are actual changes that come about. I mean, this is something that we've known that, as you said, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. But now that if they show that there are actual there's a biological basis for this.
mm,
Uh, and I think what happened, I mean, during Sita and Ram's time, Janak Baba was the epitome of simplicity and humility.
mm,
And most of society at that time was that's the Dharma, based on yoga. I mean, the idea of amassing wealth was just unknown. That was not the culture of the time. We're talking about Treta Yuga. And one thing that has been very important to me is trying to get into the consciousness of a Treta Yuga person. It was a different consciousness. But Ravana was breaking those bounds. He was bringing in these new ideas of wanting wealth. And we see people breaking bounds today of in our society, kind of
Mm.
bringing in new concepts that are harmful. We have billionaires, soon we'll have trillionaires. I mean, what's the end of that? I mean, how much? How much? You know, uh, and until we come to the recognition of the finiteness of the material world and the fact that is damaging to the person as well.
Mm.
It's not good for anybody to accumulate that kind of wealth or power, because wealth brings power, as we see now.
And I think once again, the foundation of all this you just said is in the time of King Janaka, the consciousness during that was the end of Treta Yuga was just different. And even then, I found it interesting in the Ramayana, they are reminiscing in the Ramayana,
Satya Yuga.
like, oh, remember what it was like during Sat Yuga. For them, Sat Yuga was the glorious. Now we're looking at Treta Yuga. God, I wish it was like Treta Yuga. And because as we hopefully are finishing Kali Yuga, or some people feel that we're heading into a golden age within Kali Yuga, whichever way you look at this sequence of yugas. But the, it's the consciousness. There was a consciousness lively at that certain quality of time. The collective consciousness, that was the term you just used. Jung used that term as well. Um, um, this collective consciousness, my teacher Maharishi used that term. How can we raise the collective consciousness, which is the key? And I know you do that with your institute. We have to raise the collective consciousness of the planet that disallows that kind of incredible narrow boundaries, that greed on the subtlest level. And it may be the only way. I mean, the great sages, the rishis who live in the forest in India still today, these yagyas that go on, these large group yagyas, um, having large groups of meditators meditating together at the same time, which I know is done um, within your teaching as well as mine. Those are going to, those to me, that may be the only way to raise the collective consciousness. So it disallows those negative tendencies to arise in the first place.
It's a combination. I think that's the inner work we do individually and collectively, but it's also allowing certain karma to play out. I mean, there's a law of
Mm.
cause and effect, right? Uh, uh, and it works at a collective level as well as an individual level. And the quicker we can understand the causes that led to certain conditions, the quicker we can say, aha, well, we're going to change course. I mean, there are ways to counter. I mean, how do you counter greed? Through greater generosity. So, having had this teaching come to me through writing that chapter, I say to myself, okay, how can I be more generous in my life?
Mm.
Looking at it at a very personal level, how can I be less judgmental in my life? Because it comes up, you have to catch yourself, right?
Mm.
So there's certain collective karma that's playing out right now. And, if it takes 10 years to play out, in cosmic time, that's a blink of an eye. That's a day. So we have to both be in and out of Earth time. We have to deal in the moment and see that that these effects of past causes, and to really look and understand it and
Mm.
acknowledge. I mean, you know, I don't want to focus it on the US right now because this will have a global audience. But, for every nature to really acknowledge what harm it's caused and what's led to the current conditions. I think that's an important step. Um, in the US, what we say, we've never really acknowledged the mistakes made during the Iraq War. Nobody was held accountable. We never acknowledged the crash of 2008. Nobody was held accountable for that, and yet it caused a lot of suffering. There's a lack of accountability,
Mm.
and you can avoid that in terms of human justice, but not on the cosmic scale.
Right. There's no, as you sow, so shall
Karma
you reap.
works.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's one thing that bothers me the most. I agree with you, is our level of collective denial. You know, people do at the time they feel like they're doing the action that they need to do. But when you have total denial of these actions that were against the laws of nature and caused great suffering. You can't learn from your mistakes. Those who don't know
Yeah.
history, as Arnold Toynbee said, those who don't know history are condemned to repeat their mistakes. And so this is a time when there has to be a collective reckoning with redefining what the path of right action is. And I want to come back to Sita because I think one of the most powerful things in Untold Story of Sita, which was also brought out in Sita's Gems. Vandana Shiva, the great environmentalist, did the introduction and conclusion in Sita's Gems, really honing in on Sita's role with nature. She's born of the earth. She's a daughter of the earth. She was nature herself, our Prakriti. And as you described in Untold Story of Sita, during the time of of King Janaka, that there was a complete cultivation, union, blessing, nourishing quality of the relationship with nature. They didn't try to overpower, take from nature, that greed quality. That greed quality starts with making nature serve us instead of us serving nature. And immediately that changes your field of consciousness when you think of us. How can we serve, nourish, and support nature just as she does for us? To me, that's the starting point of this separation from our environment, from the planet, and from its people. And the beauty
That
of it is Sita embodies that so beautifully. That's one of the greatest lessons of Sita for me personally, is how she was nature. She wouldn't do anything to harm nature. She wouldn't do anything to harm herself. And Ram, who came from a different kingdom where there was a slightly different laws of nature, learned to surrender into Sita's consciousness, where Ram and Sita became one in their blessed mm, nourishment and embodiment of all of nature. That was one of my favorite parts of Untold Story of Sita.
in Traita Yuga, there was this natural integration, and that's why the sages were able to work with nature to keep the balance, to keep things flowing, because they weren't trying to control it or dominate. They were just part of the flow. And that was the consciousness of the Treta Yuga, and that consciousness was declining as this Treta Yuga was coming to an end. By the time you get to the Dwapara Yuga, sometime later, it's gone. Already this domination impulse. I mean, there was no domination impulse at that time to dominate women. That's why I call it a pre-patriarchal time. Women had as much freedom as men. There was no distinction. There was no domination of nature. There was no slavery. There was no really people capturing others. There was
Mm,
no hierarchy. The domination impulse has not yet been cultivated.
mm,
Ravana is beginning to change that. He's
mm,
beginning to insert this
mm,
this domination gene
mm.
into the human psyche,
Beautiful
which,
point. Yeah,
yeah, and in a way, that's what they were battling, and that's been with us since, and that's what we have to fight right now, as it
exactly.
manifests in many ways: domination of nature, domination of other people, economic domination. Any kind of domination, that's that domination gene that doesn't belong with us. We want to outgrow it. That's part of the evolution.
Mm.
We started by talking about Ram and Sita's role in the evolution. That's our evolution now, is to uproot that domination gene so that we can live more harmoniously.
Yeah, and we can see how we're on that evolutionary arc, how we are evolving right now. And we're praying that this is like the last hurrah of that dominant gene and not the beginning of its proliferation. We're hoping this is just when sometimes ignorance has its last stronghold, and we're hoping that ignorance has its last stronghold right now. And then we're going to come into this golden age. Maybe that's optimistic thinking, maybe it's a little bit idealistic, but that's what we're hoping for, is that people begin to see, and in terms of this practice, like you talk in the yogas, the Sitas Yoga, I think the seed, what I'm having in this dialogue with you, and I'm seeing that seed of that quality of Ravana's DNA, which begins with a sense of domination and control to serve oneself, and the subjugation of the environment, women, because women seem to hold that energy, um, slavery, all those elements, those are the seeds of domination. And how can we uproot those seeds of domination in us? That's when it's fear-based. It's a moment of
Fear-based.
fear that I cannot have enough and I need to take from others so I have enough. It's fear. Duality is born of fear. I'm just all these lines from the Bhagavad Gita are popping up for me. Duality is born of fear. Anger is born of fear and duality. And those
Yeah.
that's where we get separated. How can we uproot that sense? It's duality. It's the field of me and them, myself and the environment. And that's the seed of domination. And how can we as anyone who's watching, probably they wouldn't be watching this and they're already well on the path to their evolution. But it's all the other people out there in the world who haven't even woken up at all to see that. But when there's a collective environment, creating a collective field that begins to disallow that, you don't need everyone in the population. You need a small, coherent group, and that does radiate out. I believe that happens, and the research shows that actually, with having these collective groups meditating, they can change crime rate. For example, that's what happened in the demonstration in Washington D.C. in 1993.
Yeah. I think that there is so much fear that's being generated right now. I mean, fear is also being used to control people, right?
Mhm.
That's how it works. Uh, and so there are ways to counter. I mean, you're right. Meditation is the key because then you tap into your eternal energy. I mean, what's the worst can happen? You could die, but you're an eternal being. You don't lose
Mhm.
consciousness. You move on to someplace else.
Mhm.
So, countering fear is one of the big challenges at the moment. Countering fear and countering anger, I think, and
Mhm.
countering greed. I mean, it's right. Those are
Mhm.
the
Yeah,
the
those
same
are the
ones that
big.
have been with us for a
Yeah.
long time.
And at the root, I would say fear is probably the most fundamental. It's just a fundamental fear, which is what it is, that fear. You're not identifying with your holistic cosmic self. You're identifying with a very narrow boundary. And in that boundary, you see that person is everything else is separate, and you need to control it because it'll hurt you. It'll take away from you.
Two things I've discovered through the writing of this current book. One is that you only have judgment when you can't see the past. So Ram killing Bali, we don't know Bali's past. If we knew that didn't happen out of nowhere. There
Right.
was a previous thing that led to that event. And that's true of everything. Everything has an earlier cause. So when you can
Mm,
see the earlier cause, you can understand it better. I mean, in your own life, things happen you don't understand. Well, there was a reason, there was an earlier cause that led to that. And so I speak a lot about karma in all of my books. I mean, that's a central theme,
mm,
trying to show how earlier causes lead to certain conditions. But the other thing that I speak about often that I think is central, and I think is the next frontier, the instinctual fear comes from people not understanding death. And if you
mm,
can understand death and experience it, because there are stages in meditation where you do experience that death, you do experience leaving the body and entering another realm. And we exist in that realm as well. So the deeper you get into the nature of this whole thing, I mean, physics is showing this could be a holographic projection from a light plane,
mm,
energy plane, an
mm,
astral plane, where we exist and we are projecting ourselves into this
mm,
appearance of physicality. So the more we can penetrate that mystery of death, I think the more fear will go away. And I think that's one of the challenges. I think science is going to come to that understanding within a short period of time. Short meaning could be decades, could be centuries.
No, it's interesting that you bring that up because, there's all kinds of new research, and I'm not talking about esoteric research. I'm talking about mainstream research right now on the process of dying and how the consciousness does persist a little while after death. And first of all, we're getting more and more documentation of people having near-death experiences, even in the operating room, and what they go through in terms of entering into the perception of cosmic reality, and then for some reason their lives are saved. They come back and they described it. But even now they're talking about they've actually done research on what happens in the brain chemistry during those moments of death. And I think the scientific research will begin to show literally to point us in the direction where there is an eternal succession of incarnations of our own being, then something, even if they don't have the whole picture, something is sustained. But I think you're right in the sense that, I was being granular with going down to fear being the core emotion and drive that perpetuates this greed and all these other tendencies. But at the root of fear, you're right, is fear of death. And none of us, no one's getting out of here alive. Many of us are not.
All getting out of here alive, just a different way of being alive.
Actually, that'll be a fun thing to say because there's a line, no one's getting out of here alive. And at the same time, everyone's getting out of here alive on a different plane. And if we
I think
accepted that at a
we,
deepest level, it would
Well,
change
you're
things.
right. I mean, physics has already proven the non-locality of consciousness,
Mm,
meaning the brain doesn't create consciousness, it's consciousness creates the material vehicle. And they're also, I think, uncovering that we're a multidimensional universe. So the cutting edge of physics is coming to this. So, what does multidimensionality mean? You move into another dimension. You move out of this dimension
mm,
into another dimension, and then come back into this dimension to fulfill certain things that have been left undone. So I think I mean, all these things, I think science and spiritual practice eventually will go hand in hand, as they did during the time of the Rishis. I always talk about the Vedic sciences. It was science, not a belief, that when those Rishis spoke of, you
And
know?
it's well known now that those ancient rishis, they already had cognized the circumference of the planet. They
Yeah.
knew the
And
nature of the stars and their
sun,
distance.
I mean, they knew all of that.
It's amazing, and that was thousands and thousands of years old. So the ancient Vedic rishis, they cognized the nature of reality. And to whatever extent in the interpolations that followed, that's what I think, even though, there might be some different disagreements on the narrative of the story, Valmiki cognized some fundamental structures that even if there's some things that may be off, this binary code, it's like, to me, it's basically the Vedas in story form. That's the Ramayana. It's Brahman on the stage. And the Ramayana becomes a vehicle, direct means for the unfoldment of Brahman, our totality, by purifying our emotional body, by this discrimination. That's why I've been with the Ramayana for 30 years now, and why you've been with it for so long, because we find this deep intrinsic truth that I think is incredibly potent and valuable today. Just this discussion we're having reminds me of how potent and how timely and modern the Ramayana is, for had this deeper understanding on how to deal with ourselves and how to deal with these Ravanic tendencies and evil. So what's the essence of it? Knowing thyself, purifying the seeds of karma, um, uprooting these tendencies within us, starting with our individual consciousness. And look at the time of Ram. They had large groups of rishis meditating in the kingdom and doing their yagis in the kingdom. That was part of political science at the time. Every kingdom
Yeah.
had whole cadres of rishis doing yagis and meditating together, which uplifted the
Not
collective
only that,
consciousness.
you had yogis. Look at Janak Baba. He was a very
Mm,
advanced yogi, and he was
mm,
he was a king. I mean, you
mm,
had political Ram. You had political leaders who were, you know, those kinds of beings. But I want to uh, add something else, that I have a chapter in my new book called "The Yoga of Controlling the Inner Electricities." And
mm,
I smiled when I did this because I said most people think they didn't know about electricity back in the
mm,
day.
mm,
But they did. They understood the whole
mm,
construct of the universe. I mean, my Param Guru, Sri Yukteswar, in his book, The Holy Science, talks a little bit about the knowledge of the Treta Yuga. And he says they understood much more about electricity than we know now. We don't
mm,
understand what it is. We
mm,
understand some of its properties, but we don't know what it is. And they understood about divine magnetism, which
mm.
we don't understand magnetism. So that's why I'm saying it's very hard to get into the mindset of a Treta Yuga person, because they had a much more complete understanding of the whole structure of the universe than we do now with all our
Because
scientific advances.
we use science, and science has done amazing things. We use science to dominate. Basically, it's based on the fear the natural environment is a dangerous force, and we need to insulate and protect ourselves from the natural forces. And that is a complete, that's only been around since the time of Descartes, really, or actually before that as well. But in the time of the ancient Vedic Rishis, their whole use of science was to be in union with the environment and themselves. It's a whole different strategy.
Universe. And the universe, and it was through the intuitive faculty, which was diminished over time as the rational faculty took over.
Mm,
So they depended much more on intuitive knowledge. That's how they could know the circumference of the stellar, of the
mm,
moon, and they didn't have a measuring stick to do
mm.
it. Intuitively, they knew.
Right. It was,
And we need to cultivate that intuitive faculty, which is something that happens through spiritual practice. Your intuitive faculty is cultivated and does become more prominent.
I mean, what was that one book by Deepak Chopra, Return of the Rishis? That was one of his first books, I believe. That one, we are trying to return to our Rishi-like nature, which is the capacity to know, to have that knowingness. And Vedic cognition is kind of the highest level of that knowingness. I mean, the ancient Vedic seers had Vedic cognition where they could go deep and fathom the deepest laws of nature and see. And that's why they were Vedic scientists. Each of them had a different slight angle on what they looked at, but each of them, that was their gifts. Now, we may not be the greatest Vedic seers in cognizing the subtlest fabric of creation, but just the first stages of becoming a rishi is cultivating this inner knowingness. And in that inner knowingness, there is not duality. There's no one to fight against. There's no one to dominate because, once again, a line from the Gita just popped up. Because the knowers of reality see all beings in the self and the self in all beings.
Exactly. That's the ultimate truth.
I mean, if you see the self in all beings and all beings in the self, how can you don't
When
need to
you harm
dominate them.
another, you're harming yourself. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the ultimate truth. Michael, we're coming to the end of our time. So, what final words do we want to leave? This is not the end of our conversations. I'm sure there'll be others. But I think in terms of how I know for me, it's a constant watching my inner life to try to bring them in line with the teachings that I'm hearing. And I expect that to go on until I leave this form. That's an ongoing process.
Yeah. And I think you're doing it beautifully with the yoga, Sita. Can't wait for it. But I think what I've gotten out of this conversation today, because when you and I get together, always new angles and new insights come out for me, is it's just taking this precious knowledge and finding its practical internal applications. Whether it's Sita's advice against cruelty, how does that relate with us? And these lines from the Gita, these are the ones that I'm mainly focused on the Ramayana, but how many lines from the Gita? Yoga stakura karmani. How all beings are seeing all beings in the self and the self in all beings. Fear is born of duality. All those lines are guideposts for us to roast these seeds of karma in us. I'm just weaving together some of the things that came out today. And that's we work on the individual level and just these collective impulses as well. Large groups meditating together. Yagyas, for example, I know a group in Israel who's doing yagyas, and they're not just doing these yagyas for Israel. They're doing these collective yagyas for peace in the whole region, for both sides.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think we're in a time of transition, and whenever you're in a period of transition, it's like forces that have ruled are hanging on. Old
Mm.
ways of thinking. You know how hard it is to change a habit. Old ways of thinking don't let go until they let go. There could be a moment where suddenly things could shift overnight. And we have to just do our part. And I mean, I do think if we look ahead, we're going to see a lot of things improve in the future in terms of our way of living with nature and among ourselves. But when in that future, it's hard to pinpoint.
It is hard. I hope we can hold on for the ride in the meantime, because it is going to be maybe a little bit of a rocky ride. I hope that rocky ride is short. But I think these conversations, and it's just like always the question, which is all the great sages always ask, what more can I do? What more can we do? I think that's the question we always need to ask ourselves.
So with that, thank you, Michael, for joining me, and thank you to all the listeners. And if you like this conversation, just post it in the chat, and we'll have more such conversations.
Thank you, Dina,
So
for having me. This was awesome. I really
take
loved
care,
it.
everyone.